The 12th of April, 1943. In the heart of World War II, on territory controlled by Japanese forces, a group of Allied nurses found themselves in dire circumstances after being captured and transported to prisoner-of-war camps on the archipelago. No one could have imagined that in such conditions, they would not only survive, but also save dozens of lives. This was not merely a fight for survival. It was a daily battle against hunger, disease, and the ever-present threat of death. Japanese officers, like everyone else, were stunned by how these nurses managed to hold on despite the humiliation and constant danger. In the camp, which became their new home, there was no sufficient food, and resources were extremely limited. Local civilians, at best, would hand over small amounts of rice, the main staple of their diet. This rice, the only fuel for their bodies, often became a symbol of exhaustion and fear. Many prisoners died of starvation, but the nurses, despite their vulnerability, kept performing their duties. Even in the harshest conditions, they continued to care for the wounded soldiers suffering from infections and many other diseases. The unity of the group and their selflessness in the hardest circumstances helped them retain their faith in their mission. But there was no room for weakness in the Japanese camp. The regime was brutal. The prisoners received minimal attention from their captors, and the responsibility for caring for the sick and wounded lay on the shoulders of the nurses. Sometimes, in the hardest moments, when their strength was nearly depleted, they would divide a small portion of rice among themselves, just to keep going, saving the lives of those who could not help themselves. The 12th of April, 1943 was one of the hardest days in the camp. New wounded arrived, and food was running out. Despite these conditions, the nurses continued to provide medical care, using their limited supplies, their knowledge, and sometimes pure courage. Their determination and resilience made many reflect on the incredible dedication to their work and the question of how one could survive despite all the odds. For the Japanese, who were waging a brutal war, these nurses were a mystery. It seemed that they should have surrendered, but instead, they kept working, despite the impossible conditions. Surviving in the camp required not just physical endurance, but psychological resilience. That day marked the beginning of what would become a symbol of human strength in the most inhuman of conditions. But how long could they keep fighting hunger and death? How far would a group of women go to fulfill their mission, despite the fact that the world around them was engulfed in war? The 13th of April, 1943. In the Japanese prisoner-of-war camp, an unbearable silence prevailed, interrupted only by the occasional rustle of movement and the steps of the guards. For the nurses trapped in this nightmare, every day was a struggle for survival. Every morning, starting with the grim task of counting who among the wounded was still alive and who had already perished. Yet despite the constant fear, loneliness, and almost total lack of food, they continued to save lives. The rice they received had long ceased to be enough to sustain them. At times, they received nothing but water, and their bodies were pushed to their limits. Yet they continued to care for the sick, refusing to accept the reality of their own physical exhaustion. Japanese officers, sensing that these women were not just nurses but potential symbols of resistance, tried repeatedly to break their spirit. The officers believed they were merely part of a defeated force and thought they should be ignored. Yet what they failed to understand was the power of the human will to survive, even in the most hopeless circumstances. Every day became not just a test of the body, but of the mind. The nurses worked under the most primitive conditions, lacking medications, bandages, and antiseptics. They used anything they could find. Sometimes, instead of proper medical supplies, they used scraps of cloth torn from their own clothes. It was unbearably difficult, but they did not relent. At times, when the suffering grew too intense, and their energy was almost gone, they would share a single serving of rice, just to continue doing what they had been entrusted with, saving lives. Yet, even in the face of such hardships, they continued to tend to the wounded, utilizing the little resources they had. Even when they had nothing, they still found a way to help, driven by a duty they could not ignore. The 13th of April, 1943, became a day when one of the patients, who had seemed hopeless, began to show signs of improvement. His condition had been deteriorating, and it seemed he would not survive. However, the nurses did not give up. They continued their efforts, even when they had no guarantees that their actions would succeed. In this moment, they realized that every decision, every action, was not just about professionalism, but about survival, their own and the lives of those they cared for. But how long could they keep fighting the elements of nature, hunger, and death? As the day went on, the nurses knew that no matter how bad things got, they had to press on. Their mission was clear. They would continue, no matter what. The 14th of April, 1943. In the Japanese prison camp, the situation was worsening. Hunger had become the primary enemy, not only for those confined to the cages, but also for those still at the front lines of care. Each day became a harder struggle for survival, and the nurses grew weaker with each passing hour. However, despite their growing exhaustion, they continued to work, using their knowledge and experience to save lives. They fought not only physical ailments, but also psychological despair, which could not help but affect their spirit. The rations continued to be meager, sometimes reduced to nothing more than the leaves, roots, and plants they could find in the camp. These did little to stave off the constant gnawing hunger. But despite the overwhelming exhaustion and the worsening situation, the nurses pressed on, tending to the wounded and sick, knowing that every life saved was worth the fight. The lack of proper medical supplies became an ever-growing problem. As infections spread among the prisoners, the nurses faced a dilemma. They had nothing but makeshift tools to combat the diseases that ravaged their patients. Bandages had been used up, and the few remaining medicines were reserved for the most severe cases. Yet even with such limited resources, the nurses used whatever they could find, cloth torn from their own clothes, primitive herbal concoctions to treat the wounded and infected. Their physical exhaustion, however, began to show. They had not had proper meals in days, and even their ability to think clearly was beginning to fade. But the worst part was the sense of helplessness they felt. They knew they could not save everyone, and each death felt like a personal failure. Even when it was clear that there was nothing more they could do, they refused to let go of hope. On the 14th of April 1943, another critically injured patient whose chances of survival were slim somehow began to show signs of recovery. The nurses had expected him to die, as his condition had been deteriorating rapidly. But through sheer determination, they refused to let him slip away. The nurses gave him what little they could: a basic herbal infusion to ease his pain, a ragged bandage to cover his wound, and the one thing they still had their attention and care. Despite the overwhelming obstacles, the nurses showed remarkable strength. They had no resources, no support, and no hope of any outside help. But what they did have was each other and the will to keep going. And every time they saved another life, they proved to themselves that they were capable of more than anyone could have imagined. As the day ended, they realized they had done everything possible to keep the patients alive, even when all the odds were stacked against them. They had become the last line of defense in a camp filled with despair, and their refusal to give in, no matter the circumstances, had become a symbol of strength and survival. The 15th of April, 1943. In the camp, the situation continued to deteriorate. Starvation, disease, and the scarcity of medical supplies were becoming increasingly difficult to overcome. But despite their growing weakness, the nurses continued their work, driven by the relentless need to care for those around them. Each day was a challenge, not only for their bodies, but also for their minds. Their strength was tested on every front as they faced the suffering of their patients and the constant, looming threat of their own breakdown. The food supply had dwindled even further, and what little they received had little nutritional value. The nurses found themselves surviving on meager portions, unable to nourish their bodies properly. The lack of food was starting to have an even greater impact on their ability to function. Yet, they kept going, taking care of the wounded and the sick despite their own hunger, exhaustion, and physical pain. As each day passed, it became harder to maintain even the most basic level of care. The wounded continued to pile up, and the camp was quickly becoming overwhelmed. Many of the injured were suffering from severe infections, which were spreading rapidly due to the lack of antiseptics. The nurses, using their knowledge and ingenuity, had to resort to makeshift remedies, often finding themselves treating patients with the most primitive of tools. Yet, despite all the limitations, the nurses persisted. They understood that their efforts were critical to the survival of the prisoners. They worked tirelessly, often without sleep, without food, and without any real hope of improvement. But each small success, each life saved, no matter how difficult it seemed, gave them the strength to continue. On the 15th of April, 1943, one of the most critically ill patients began to show signs of improvement. The nurses, who had spent days trying to stabilize him, could hardly believe their eyes when they saw his condition stabilize. It was a small victory, but in the context of the camp's dire conditions, it felt monumental. It reminded them that even in the darkest moments, there was still a glimmer of hope. But the camp was becoming increasingly brutal. The guards grew more aggressive, and the threats of punishment and death hung over the nurses like a constant cloud. They had no choice but to continue their work in the face of such oppression. The risk of punishment, or worse, was always looming, but the nurses could not allow fear to stop them from their mission. The horrors of the camp had begun to erode the spirit of many prisoners, but the nurses remained steadfast. They knew that, despite the overwhelming odds, they could make a difference. They were the last line of defense for many of the injured and sick, and they took that responsibility to heart. Despite the exhaustion and the ever-present dangers, the nurses continued to care for their patients, proving that even in the most dire of circumstances, humanity could still shine through. Their strength and resilience were the only things standing between the prisoners and total despair. The 16th of April, 1943. In the prison camp, the situation had reached a new level of despair. Hunger, illness, and the complete lack of proper medical supplies had brought the nurses to their breaking points. Their bodies were exhausted, but their resolve remained unshaken. Every day, they faced the brutal reality of being responsible for the lives of the wounded and sick, while the odds of survival continued to dwindle. Every day was a battle for resources. The medical supplies they had were used up long ago, and the food was barely enough to keep them alive. They had no medicine, no antibiotics, no proper equipment. Yet they kept working. They used whatever they could find, bits of cloth, improvised tools, and local herbs to care for their patients. But despite their best efforts, they couldn't help everyone. Some of the wounded, unable to receive the treatment they needed, passed away. The nurses did not have the capacity to save every life, and this fact weighed heavily on them. Each death felt like a personal failure, a reminder of the harsh limitations of their situation. But no matter how much they had lost, they could not allow themselves to give up. Every life saved, every patient who pulled through, gave them the strength to continue. On the 16th of April, 1943, another one of their patients, whom they had feared would not survive, began to show signs of recovery. His wounds had been severe, and his chances of survival had been slim. But despite everything, he was beginning to improve. It was a small miracle, but it was enough to keep their hope alive. It was moments like these small victories that allowed them to keep pushing forward, even when everything seemed hopeless. Yet, despite the brief moments of triumph, the camp continued to become more oppressive. The guards were becoming increasingly cruel, and the risk of punishment or death for any perceived disobedience was growing. The nurses were under constant threat. Every action they took to help the prisoners put them at risk, but they continued, undeterred. Their patients, many of whom had already given up hope, began to find new strength in the nurses' relentless determination. The strength of the human spirit was never more apparent than in these moments. Despite the horrors around them, the nurses refused to allow despair to take root. They continued to give everything they had, pushing past their own suffering for the sake of others. The 16th of April 1943 was a day like so many others, full of hardship and suffering, but it also served as a reminder of the resilience of the human spirit. The nurses, even in the face of the impossible, continued their mission. They were not only fighting for survival, they were fighting for the lives of those around them, and that purpose gave them the strength to endure. The 17th of April, 1943. The camp continued its downward spiral into chaos. Hunger and illness ravaged the prisoners, and the medical staff, already drained by weeks of relentless work, were reaching their breaking point. Despite their worsening condition, the nurses pressed on, determined not to give up. Every day brought new challenges, but each one also brought a small victory, a reminder that there was still hope, if only for a moment. The lack of food had become a dire issue. The prisoners were given meager portions, and even those were sometimes non-existent. The nurses had long ago given up on receiving anything resembling a proper meal. They relied on scraps, bits of leaves and roots, anything they could find to stave off hunger. But it wasn't just hunger they had to contend with. The prisoners were becoming sicker and weaker, and the nurses had fewer and fewer resources to treat them. The infections that spread rapidly through the camp were almost impossible to contain. There was no medical equipment, no antibiotics, and no proper means of sterilizing wounds. The nurses had to make do with what little they had. They used strips of cloth to make bandages and brewed herbal teas to fight infections, but they knew they were losing the battle. Each day, the conditions became more difficult, and more prisoners succumbed to their injuries. Despite the overwhelming challenges, the nurses continued their work. They knew that their efforts, even in the most desperate situations, were the only chance many of the prisoners had. Every life saved, no matter how small the victory, was enough to keep them going. On the 17th of April, 1943, one of the most critically wounded prisoners, who had been on the verge of death for days, suddenly began to show signs of improvement. His condition had been deteriorating rapidly, and the nurses had feared that he would be their next loss. But miraculously, he started to regain consciousness. The nurses, exhausted and barely able to stand, did what they could to stabilize him, giving him what little they had, a few drops of water, some herbal medicine, and their undivided attention. The improvement, though small, was enough to remind them of why they were doing what they were doing. It was enough to remind them that, despite the odds, they could still make a difference. Even in a place where so much suffering and death had taken place, they were the last line of defense for the living. The camp itself had become a place of constant fear and tension. The guards were growing more unpredictable, and the threat of punishment loomed over the nurses. Yet, despite the looming danger, they never stopped working. They were determined to keep their promise to their patients, to provide them with whatever care they could, regardless of the consequences. The 17th of April, 1943 was another day of relentless effort, but it was also another day in which they proved that, even in the most extreme conditions, they could survive and still save lives. The 18th of April, 1943. The situation in the camp had grown more dire. Hunger, disease, and the complete lack of medical supplies continued to push the nurses to the brink. They were physically and mentally exhausted, but their determination never wavered. Every day, they faced new challenges, knowing that the odds of survival were slipping away with each passing moment. The shortage of food had become unbearable. The rice they had received was no longer enough to sustain them, and they were forced to rely on whatever they could find: roots, plants, and anything else that could stave off hunger. Their bodies were weakening, but the nurses did everything they could to keep their patients alive, using every last ounce of their energy to perform the work that was essential for the survival of the prisoners. Every day was a battle. The wounds of the injured were becoming more difficult to treat, and the lack of proper medical supplies made their work nearly impossible. Infections spread unchecked, and many of the prisoners who had once had a chance of recovery were now beyond help. But the nurses, despite their growing despair, refused to stop. They knew that each person they saved was a victory, no matter how small. On the 18th of April 1943, a critically wounded soldier, who had been slipping in and out of consciousness for days, showed signs of improvement. His wounds were severe, and his chances of survival were slim, but the nurses continued to care for him, doing whatever they could to stabilize his condition. They used what little they had: a handful of herbs, bandages made from torn fabric, and worked tirelessly to keep him alive. The improvement in his condition, though minor, was a reminder of their purpose. In a camp where so many had given up, where hope seemed like a distant memory, these small moments of recovery kept the nurses going. Every life saved was a testament to their resilience, and it gave them the strength to continue despite the overwhelming odds. But outside the medical ward, the camp was becoming even more oppressive. The guards were more aggressive, and the threat of punishment hung over the nurses like a shadow. Every moment of care they provided came with a risk: the risk of retribution, the risk of their own lives. Yet, despite the danger, they kept going. Their mission was clear. They were here to save lives, and they would do so no matter the cost. The nurses, their strength nearly spent, had become the final barrier between life and death for the prisoners. They had seen so much suffering, but they remained focused on their work. In the face of so much despair, they continued to find hope, and with each small victory, they reminded themselves that they could still make a difference. The 18th of April 1943 marked yet another day of struggle, but also a day of triumph. The nurses had fought to keep their patients alive, and, despite all the obstacles, they had succeeded. The 19th of April 1943. The camp remained dark and grim, filled with despair and suffering. But despite all the horrors that surrounded them, the nurses still held on to a glimmer of hope. Each day was a battle, and their bodies, worn down by starvation and constant work, were beginning to give out. Yet their spirit remained unbroken. The situation had worsened. The scarcity of food and the relentless spread of disease were taking their toll, and the nurses were struggling to maintain even the most basic level of care. They were running out of supplies and barely able to keep up with the constant flow of patients. But in the face of these overwhelming odds, they never gave up. Each patient, each life saved, was worth the effort. On the 19th of April 1943, one of the most critically wounded soldiers, who had been barely holding on to life for days, began to show unexpected signs of improvement. His condition had been rapidly declining, and the nurses had given up hope of saving him. Yet, against all odds, he started to regain consciousness. It was a small victory, but in a place filled with so much death and suffering, it was everything. This small miracle reminded the nurses that, despite the horrors surrounding them, they still had the power to make a difference. As the day went on, hope began to flicker within the camp. The whispers of a potential rescue by the Allied forces started to spread. These rumors, though uncertain, gave the prisoners something to hold on to. For the nurses, it was a bittersweet feeling. They had given everything they had, and the possibility of salvation felt both like a relief and a reminder of all they had endured. Despite the growing signs of liberation, the danger still loomed. The guards became more erratic and brutal, knowing that their control over the camp was coming to an end. The nurses, who had already risked so much, had to continue their work knowing that the threat of punishment still hung over them. But no matter the risk, they kept going. They had made it this far, and they weren't about to stop now. The 19th of April. 1943 was not only a day of small miracles, but also a day of realization. The nurses understood that they had done everything they could. They had saved lives when it seemed impossible. They had fought against death, against hunger, against everything the world had thrown at them. And through it all, they had held on to their humanity. When the day ended, the nurses looked around at the camp and saw the faintest glimmer of hope. The suffering had not ended, but they had made it through against all odds. They had survived the darkest moments of their lives, and they had given everything to ensure that others had the chance to live. And as the possibility of liberation drew closer, the nurses knew that no matter what happened next, they had accomplished something extraordinary. They had not only fought to survive, they had fought to save lives. And in doing so, they had preserved the very essence of what it meant to be human.